Well, Ryan, I appreciate you joining me to talk about the World Watch List. This is an important release every year that gives us a sense of what is happening around the world when it comes to persecution. Now, I'm going to start from a 30,000-foot view, and you can get very specific if you want, but looking at this year's list and compared to the past, what most stands out to you?
Yeah, obviously there is an increase this year. Last year, 365 million Christians around the globe experiencing persecution, discrimination because of their faith. This year, that number increases to 380 million. But I think for me, what really stands out is when you take a look at one of the countries that didn't make the list this year, Malaysia, dropped out of that top 50. However, Malaysia's score actually increased this year. So it wasn't that things improved for them. It was rather that there were so many other places that became worse and overtook them on their place on the list. And so, across the globe, we continue to see these issues are rising and the trends are alarming.
Yeah, and that is actually a really important point, that you could have a country actually fall off the list of 50 and still be getting worse because the situation itself is getting worse everywhere, it seems. Are there any places, I guess, before we get into the difficult negatives of what is happening, are there any places where you do see trajectories improving at all? Or would you say that that's just not something we're seeing happen?
No, there have been. I think that one of the other countries that dropped off the list this year was Indonesia, and it dropped off. The score actually did lower, and it dropped by several points. And so that's an encouraging sign. Specifically, some of the things that curbed there were some of the expressions of violence that has characterized persecution in recent years. And so that is a good trend, and it appears that officials there are really trying to address those issues of violence within the country of Indonesia.
You know, when you talk about the fact that 380,000 Christians are facing serious persecution I'm sorry, 380 million of some sort around the world, that's 1 in 7 Christians. When you hear that figure, it's almost unimaginable, but that was an increase, as you mentioned. Every time we talk, I feel like it's an increase, which is scary. But what accounted, in your view, from that jump from the 365 million to the 380 million?
Yeah, there were the World Watch List lists the 50 countries where Christians are most persecuted and discriminated against. However, we watch countries around the globe. There are countries that are not on that list, and we have seen many of those countries that not necessarily on the list continuing to see increasing levels of persecution. There are more that are being watched and needing to be watched because that's where we're seeing a lot of growth in those numbers. When you take a look at the top 10 list, wasn't that the populations changed there or those types of things. The list, there was a little bit of movement within those top 10 countries, but it largely the same list that we saw last year. But it's really around that 50, the lower ends of the list where we're seeing a lot of movement in some of those things.
Yeah, that's interesting because the top end is where most of the focus tends to be, right? Which is great because we need to understand what's going on there. But the idea that you have these other countries that are either on the top end of the list or they're off the list that could eventually end up on the list and they need to be monitored, that is important to discuss. And this is an extensive report. It's more than 60 pages diving into all of this. But let's talk about the top persecutor. Where is the most difficult nation right now to live as a Christian in the world?
Yeah, that again remains North Korea. It has been on the list, continues to be on the top of the list, and in many ways they are kind of at the top. They've peaked out, if you will, on some of the measurements. However, we did even see some movement in some of their violence indicators this year, which continues to drive those things forward. And so North Korea continues. I think now, the 32 years that we've been reporting this data, it's been the majority of those years that North Korea has been on top of the list.
So people who may not know this, and we've covered it a lot at CBN, I know, this has been talked about a lot, but some people don't really know what is going on in these countries. So when it comes to specific types of persecution that have created a situation where North Korea is number one almost exclusively. What are those situations? What is the type of persecution people face there?
Yeah, that is there. As you said, there are different drivers around the globe, and we're seeing in places like North Korea. And increasingly as well in other Central Asia countries, some of those that popped on the list this year, this tends to be the case. But this idea of these authoritarian regimes and see allegiance to anything other than the state as a threat to the state. And so any expression of Christianity, typically is looked to be stamped out and with great severity. Individuals that, if they're found in possession of a Bible, if, they're engaged in any type of Christian worship, it's generally expected, if that's not a death sentence, it is a life sentence for imprisonment and work camps that deplorable conditions.
China is another country, obviously, where there's a similar dynamic in terms of the state and communism and Christianity and religion sort of being seen, at least in some quarters, as a threat to that. And there have been reports over the years and obviously different views on to the extent to which this is happening, but that they're trying to rewrite the Bible, that they have obviously their own version of the Bible that is approved through the Chinese Communist Party, and that they don't want the real version of the Bible to be out there. Can you reflect on the situation in China that you observed this past year?
Yeah, and China did move up on the list this year. And a lot of that is because much of the growth in the Chinese church has been in the form of historically smaller house churches, and some of those house churches have actually grown to be quite large. And the Chinese government over the last couple of years has had a very intentional and deliberate effort to stamp out many of those unregistered churches. For those churches that are registered, there is a lot of ideological control that the state is looking to exert. Looking for pledges of to the Communist Party there, and things being printed and listed for. To declare that loyalty to the state, sermon reviews, those types of things. And so, many of those smaller churches, they have been forced even deeper underground. And those smaller registered churches being forced to consolidate with this idea that the larger the churches are, the easier they are to control.
It's really unimaginable for the American mind to wrap itself around some of the things that we're talking about here. And, we have a First Amendment, we have freedom. And of course, there's an ongoing battle even within the United States to maintain that. But we have incredible freedom here. When you were going over the stories, the case studies, you have the numbers and then you have the individual stories that make them up. Is there one particular persecution story that just really got you or that stuck with you the most this past year as you were going and poring over all of the content?
There is. There's a specific gentleman I met, Ibrahim. We've posted a video, had opportunity to engage with him, and that can be checked out on the website. But, there are elements that, in the days that we spent together that obviously weren't in the video. And one of the things that we were talking about, so he's from Sudan and was a Muslim background believer who came to Christ and was imprisoned there in Sudan for sharing his faith and looking to evangelize. And, as he was talking about the persecution, I know that Jesus said that, blessed are the persecuted, and, for great is their reward in heaven. But as he was talking about persecution, it almost seemed as it was a blessing in the present tense, that it was not just this future blessing, but one that was a reality for him right now. And I asked him about that, and he said that it was a blessing because he said in terms of his faith, when he went into prison, he said, I went in as a kitten, I came out as a lion. I said, as I went in and experienced the darkness of that prison cell, the light of Christ burned brighter for me. I greater recognized my poverty of spirit, and the riches of Christ became all the more real to me. And, So often when we here in the West, when we think about persecution, the overriding sense that many of us tend to bring to that conversation or walk away is that this one of fear, this one of persecution is to be avoided at any cost. But my brother just gives me this great example that's going to stick with me for many years. That greater is He that is in us than he who is in the world. And even in the face of the most staunch persecution that this world can face, can dole our way, Christ is present there. Christ is in the midst of that, and Christ is able to lift up those who are weak. And so, His testimony, His story, is one that will really stick with me.
Yeah, it's really incredible to be able to put a face to these stories too, because we don't want this, and I love that you guys do that so well. You don't want this to only be numbers. You need the numbers, but it's very easy to allow the numbers just as, even as journalists or people in the community, oh, well, this percentage or this number, it's like, well, here's the people, here's what they've gone through, here's what they've taken away from it, and here's what's really happening to real people. I think that really helps bring it home. So I appreciate you sharing that. And one other thing before we go here that I wanted to talk about briefly is, Nigeria. Nigeria comes, I believe, at number 7 on this year's report. And yet we also hear that Nigeria is the place where a lot of, like, the majority of Christians are dying there. And there's a lot that's happened there. I know it's been at the top of the list before. Talk a little bit about just where Nigeria is right now and what is most concerning about the situation there.
Yeah, I often point to Nigeria as really kind of a snapshot of a pattern that we're seeing echoed throughout the continent of Africa and in so many places, unfortunately. And, persecution doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's impacted by the greater societal context in which it exists. And when that greater societal context is one where there is inherent stability, and there can be vacuums of power and those types of things. We've seen over and over where there have been often Islamic militants that have been willing to and desiring to step into those vacuums to perpetuate the instability. And, in those vacuums, Christians often are targets because, violence can be, acted upon towards them often with impunity. In that fragile state context, the rule of law is just not able to afford to provide those protections. And even when they are, Christians are often last in line to receive those protections. And so in Nigeria, we do see that. We see that with Fulani militants. We see that with Islamic militants in other parts of the country, where they're stepping into those vacuums and specifically targeting Christians. And as you mentioned, there were more Christians that were killed because of their faith in Nigeria this last year than any other place in the globe.
Yeah, it is incredibly heartbreaking, and I appreciate that the World Watch List and Open Doors continues to drive this home and provide data and information that helps us better comprehend what is happening globally. I appreciate your time today and breaking it all down.
Thank you so much. Honored to be with you.